I have this weird thing where I want to lose myself in the woods somewhere, trying to survive on my own for a while. Does anyone else feel this way? Well, before I give in to that desire, and before you do too, and we all wind up lost forever or washed up lifeless on the riverbank, I'm gonna have to convince us that it isn't a good idea. So what better way to convince someone that a certain place is a bad place to visit than to show them the most horrifying things that have happened there? In this case, these are real-life horrors in the woods. Enjoy these stories and be sure to share your own at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. Cries of the Night from Stephanie G. This is a story from New Mexico, specifically at the Oasis State Park. With that said, my family lives about 15 minutes away from there. We had planned to go camping at the Oasis, but we were not going unprepared. So after some steady yet careful preparation, the time for the trip comes. We arrive and set up camp, putting our tent in the back of the truck because of the fear of rattlesnakes on the ground sneaking up on us in the night. Across the road from our campsite was a trail leading to the bathrooms and a pond. Now you should know during the 70s and 80s, Oasis State Park was the home to a satanic cult that held rituals, or whatever you would call it, on these grounds. The cult would practice rituals with animal sacrifices too. Law enforcement ended up having to get involved, forcing the cult members out of the park. Now back to our story. After setting up camp and walking down to the pond to do some fishing, we came back just to relax. We enjoyed the scenery and wildlife. We watched as tiny lizards scurried about on the campsite floor. They were fast too. As evening approached, we could hear coyotes howling in the distance, but as it grew late into the night, we heard the sound of crying. This did not sound like normal crying. It sounded somehow like a woman and a child crying together in unison, like their two voices were harmonized. It was constant, and it didn't take a breath either. The sound of the crying just kept going and echoing throughout the forest. For safety reasons, or paranoid reasons, we decided to sleep in the truck. The following day, everything seemed fine. We had a great time, making several trips to the pond and back, enjoying the scenery and wildlife as before. That evening, we sat down and enjoyed some YouTube and podcasts while relaxing. Again, we began to hear the coyotes howling in the distance. It was eerie but relaxing, if that made sense. By 1 a.m., there was a dog barking in the campsite next to us. You could hear crickets chirping in the distance, as well as a light breeze picking up. Then immediately, in under half a second, all of those sounds stopped. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. But that silence was soon broken by a growl. We grabbed our flashlights in a hurry, shining them across the road to where the growling was coming from. But all we saw were still trees. It grew quiet again, until the growling erupted once more in a different spot across the road. We moved the beams of our flashlights in a jittery pursuit, and finally, we spotted it, a tall, pale figure. "Do you see that? Do you see that?" I asked my spouse, panicking. "See what?" She was just as scared, but I don't think she saw the figure that I did. "There's a figure in the trees." "Where? I don't see it." "Over there." I point when I looked back to where the figure was, but it wasn't standing there anymore, and I can't exactly describe it further than that. I was not wearing my glasses at the time, and all I could see was how tall it was. It was human-shaped, and it was quite pale. I looked at my wife, Do you think we should go home?" My voice trembling. She nodded, and we then performed the fastest camp pack-up in history, throwing stuff in the back of the truck in the tent, just trying to get the heck out of there. As my spouse was putting the spare tire into the tent, she stopped and looked towards the trees across the road again. She looked into the exact spot that I'd seen the figure. I asked, "Are you okay?" But she said nothing, save for eventually telling me to get in the truck. I listened, and we hauled tail out of that park. When we were on the highway, my spouse turned to me and asked, "Do you want to know what I saw?" Of course," I said, worried about her. There was some figure, tall, lightly skinned, and I think it had horns on its head, but I can't be sure. Maybe it could have been branches, but they looked so similar to horns that that would be a major coincidence. I don't think I want to come back here, at least for a while. I agreed. I was too terrified to even consider coming back there, even during the day. Whatever that was, it did not look or sound friendly. I mean, it was growling at us, and I don't think anything we had on us at the time would have done much good if it came down to a fight. Beware of Oasis State Park, and whatever that is that lurks inside. A Sound in the Dark, Part 1, from Mr. Smith. This is a pretty long one, and it's been nearly a year since it happened, but I will do my best to recount every detail that I can remember. This is the story of the days and weeks leading up to a moonlit October night in the rural heartland of the southeastern US. But before I begin, there are a few things you should know. My family has owned a moderately sized farm in a very rural county for 6 generations, and we have all sorts of strange stories and family lore about the land. I'd love to share more, but for now I'll focus on this story. Just know that this farm has a history of peculiar happenings. My grandfather had passed away suddenly while I was completing my senior year of college, and my father had recently moved out of state for his job, taking my mother with him. This left me as the only immediate family member in any position to manage the land. So as soon as I finished my exams and made my proud walk across the stage for my diploma, I packed up all my belongings into the truck and headed home. I have to admit that it was pretty nice to be back in my old hometown, even though lots of little things had changed. However, by far the strangest thing I came back to was the old farm. Even though I had spent a huge portion of my childhood running around the orchards, swimming in the creek, and hunting deer and turkey in the woods and hayfields of that farm, I'd never actually lived there. So it felt strange indeed to be coming home to that house. Moving in was at least fairly easy, as the house was practically empty. There wasn't even a clock left on the wall or a single potted plant left on the porch. I might be easily spooked, but I have to admit, the emptiness made the place a little creepy, especially combined with the isolation. The driveway to get to the farmhouse is about half a mile long, and the nearest neighbors are close enough to hear a gunshot, but not close enough to hear a call for help. To make matters worse, apparently while I was away, a serious coyote population had moved into the area. On clear and calm evenings, I could hear at least 5 different packs of coyotes raising Cain all over the area. They're not usually a real threat to humans, but they can carry some nasty diseases, and their howling is certainly an eerie sound to hear on a dark and foggy night. Nevertheless, I have to admit that life was good. I'd gotten a job at a local machine shop that paid well enough to make ends meet, and also gave me a little bit of pocket money to spare. Meanwhile, I was using my free time and money to fix up the farm. I repaired fence lines, trimmed the long-neglected orchards, and put up new tree stands at a few choice places around the property. I even rekindled a high school romance with a nice local girl who now owned her own business in town. Like I said, life was good. Things didn't start to get weird until around September, but boy, did they get weird real quick. It began one evening very early in September, which is still really summertime in my area. The sun had gone down, but it wasn't completely dark yet, and I had just finished picking the first autumn apples in one of the orchards. I was unpacking the baskets from the back of my truck, enjoying the coolness of the evening after the long, hot day, when I noticed an unfamiliar sound. What was strange about it was that I couldn't really tell you when it started, because it wasn't sudden or really even that noticeable. It's hard to describe, but I just gradually became aware that the evening wasn't as quiet as usual, and when I listened closely to it, I finally realized that there was a low, droning, and constant howl echoing across the landscape. Now, this wasn't the howl of a coyote or even a wolf. I've heard both of these before, and this was certainly something different. In fact, at first I didn't think it was an animal at all. It sounded more like the howl of wind through the old boards, or the sound that worn-out tires make when you go just the right speed on the interstate. I hadn't yet gotten around to hauling away some of the junk around the farmyard, so I figured that some old scrap must have been catching the wind just right to make the howl. Perhaps a piece of tin roofing or some rusted-out sheet metal. However, the noise continued to gradually grow louder, and that was when I noticed that there was no wind blowing at all, not even a slight breeze. At that point, I was beginning to feel uneasy, but still, there was nothing to be alarmed about, right? There wasn't any crashing footsteps or glowing red eyes staring out from the woods at me. I figured maybe it was the sound of some electric farm equipment on some of the neighbors' property. After all, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that some manufacturer makes an eco-friendly tractor that makes plenty of operating noise, but lacks the signature rumble of a diesel engine. By this point, I had finished unpacking my tools and the few buckets of apples from the truck, but the howling had actually become louder. It seemed to be coming from a stand of woods off to one side of the back fields, but it was hard to tell since all of the outbuildings have a tendency to bounce sound around quite a lot. Another thing that made the sound difficult to pin down was the low and constant nature of it. It was almost as though it simply hung in the air, rather than really coming from anywhere specific. I decided that I didn't really like trudging through the woods with a flashlight and a shotgun, and I figured that the truth would probably come out in the morning light. So I simply pulled my truck into the garage and headed inside. Nothing else happened that evening, but once I got inside the house, it finally hit me just how loud the howl had gotten. When I stepped inside and shut the door, my ears were ringing. The soft silence of the farmhouse seemed profound by comparison. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed the howling a few more times, but I wasn't able to pin down any concrete pattern or cause and effect surrounding it. The one thing I noticed was that it always started at dusk, and it would usually happen after a night or two of intense coyote activity. The following day, the whole farm would be dead calm. I asked around with some of my neighbors, but none of them reported experiencing anything like what I described. Naturally, this was quite a concern to me, and I began to wonder, might I be developing hearing problems or something like that? Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, this proved not to be the case. One night in late September, a friend of mine from college was passing through on his way to visit some family, so I let him crash at the farm with me for the night. I heard him coming up the long gravel driveway just past sundown, and I headed out onto the front porch to meet him. As soon as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I noticed that the sourceless howling was rolling over the fields that night, but I decided to just ignore it for the sake of my friend. However, as soon as he got out of the car, his ears perked up, and he looked around suspiciously for a few moments. "You hear it too?" I asked him, suddenly relieved that I wasn't going crazy or developing tinnitus. "Yeah, what is that?" he asked nervously. I told him a few of my theories, but I confided in him that it was starting to spook me a bit, since it had been going on at random for nearly 4 weeks by now. We both eventually laughed about it, but we spent the rest of the evening indoors, except for the few times he went out onto the porch for a smoke. What's more, every time he would come back inside, he would shake his head and say, "I guess it's still out there," telling me that the howling has not stopped. After that night, the howling did not return for more than a week, and in the meantime, I busied myself with work at the machine shop. I was also putting all of my spare time into picking apples, plums, pears, pecans, and wild grapes. All the bounty of autumn, and a reward for a summer of hard work. Besides, it was hunting season, and it was high time to get back into the woods for a chance at a nice side of venison. Now, I'd been tracking a small herd of deer back and forth across the property for a few weeks, and I'd gotten nice and comfortable in my tree stand in the early evening. I was scanning the fields for any signs of movement when I heard a lone coyote start to howl not too far away. Soon enough, a whole group of them had taken to barking and howling, and they were close too. Their barks and yips drew closer and closer, coming from just beyond the tree line, about 400 yards ahead of me. I picked up my .35 caliber rifle, then looked through the scope, scanning the trees for any signs of movement. All of a sudden, 2 does and a very small buck leapt out of the trees and bounded across the field, moving swiftly across my firing line from right to left. They were on the very edge of my rifle's effective range, but I could tell that they were running from something. Sure enough, a few moments later, a group of 4 or 5 coyotes tumbled out of the brush in hot pursuit. It's rare for coyotes to be so aggressive, but when they have numbers on their side, nothing is off the table for them. The light was fading now, and as I watched through the scope, one of the deer began to fall behind the rest of the group. The coyotes were gaining on it rapidly. I considered firing into the air to scare them off, but I figured it wouldn't do anything with the pack all hopped up on adrenaline, so I decided not to waste the ammunition. However, as soon as the coyotes had the doe surrounded, and it looked like they were about to move in for an early supper, they suddenly stopped and began to yelp. All of them looked in the same direction and ignored the exhausted doe. At first, I was puzzled by this, but then I heard it. The low moaning howl had begun. It was barely audible, but it was surely there. The coyotes continued to yelp and bark, circling the doe nervously, but constantly looking across the field towards the opposite tree line, almost like they weren't sure whether to flee and leave their prey alone or ignore the howling and go in for the kill. The howling grew louder and louder, and the coyotes finally turned tail and ran back in the direction they'd come from, vanishing silently in the trees as the last of the evening light faded away. I peered through my scope and looked up and down the tree line that the coyotes had been fixated on just a few moments before, but in the inky darkness and rising mist, I could not see anything but the tangled shadows of sycamores and dogwoods. For just a moment, I thought maybe I caught a glimpse of movement, but I could not be sure in that gathering darkness. The howling continued for another half hour or so, and that whole time I stayed stone still in my tree stand. I was riveted to my seat in hopes of finally solving the mystery of the phantom sound, and I won't pretend that I wasn't a little bit scared to get down and walk across the fields, back to the house after what I'd just witnessed. But eventually, the rumbling of my stomach and the chill of the October air drove me back to the comfortable warmth of my house. That was not the last time I heard the howling. A Sound in the Dark, Part 2. Following that night in the tree stand, I was even more curious and on edge about the mysterious howl. But what could I do? I had checked every trail camera on the property and never seen anything out of the ordinary. A few deer, some coyotes, a neighbor's four-wheeler, a stray cat, and some raccoons and possums. Furthermore, on my regular rounds of checking the trees and fence lines, I'd never found any suspicious tracks or trails. And every time I had ventured back into the woods, often going fairly deep, to track deer, I hadn't seen anything more than a few coyote signs in deer beds. The mystery was occupying my thoughts more and more, and I was glad for any distraction that came my way. So, when one of my neighbors knocked on the door, wanting help gathering honey from his beehives, I was happy to accept and distract myself. If you've never extracted honey, it's an intensive job that requires constant supervision to do right, so my neighbor and I had plenty of time to talk. Mostly we made small talk, but gradually the conversation shifted to something we both had in common: hunting. We talked about the bucks we had seen that year and the best recipes for the perfect deer jerky. He briefly mentioned how it used to be much harder to hunt around these parts due to a pretty prolific poacher. I had never actually heard this story, beyond a few snippets of local folklore, so naturally I inquired about the details. All of this apparently happened well before my time, way back in the late 1970s, and according to my neighbor, who's a good 45 years my elder for context, the deer population in this part of the county had all but been wiped out at the hands of one man. He would trespass on all the farmsteads in the area with impunity, and he would hunt year-round. On more than one occasion the sheriff was called, but the investigation never got anywhere since the poacher was always long gone by the time the lawmen arrived. Nobody in the area knew the guy either, which led to the rumor that he must have come across the county line. Eventually, the poaching just stopped, and most of the locals figured the law had finally caught up to him. That is until my grandfather and my great-uncle stumbled upon an overturned tree stand on the edge of their land, now my land, with several spent casings scattered across the base. A few dozen yards away, they discovered a broken rifle that they both immediately recognized as belonging to that poacher. The police were called and a detective was sent to the farm. He asked my grandfather a few questions about the poacher and eventually pulled out a photograph, asking if this was the man in question. Sure enough, it was him, and when they told the detective as much, he informed them that the man was the subject of a missing persons investigation. About a month prior, he had simply fallen off the face of the earth. Police and canine units combed the area around the farm afterwards, but no trace of the man was ever found. The police eventually closed the missing persons case and ruled the man's death an accident. They reasoned that the man's tree stand had toppled over due to wind or uneven ground, and he had been mortally wounded in the fall. Maybe he had survived long enough to crawl away and had died of his wounds somewhere else. Or maybe he had died on the spot and his body had simply been dispersed by scavenging animals. Of course, nobody around here actually believed that. The general consensus was that one of the locals had finally gotten fed up with his hijinks and decided to take matters into their own hands. But nobody could ever figure out who had done it, and no one ever came forward to talk about it, so the issue had quietly faded into obscurity. This story was one that I had heard referenced occasionally in passing by my grandfather, but I had never heard the tale in its entirety. Honestly, it made me think of the way the howling had scared off the coyotes in the middle of their hunt just a few nights before. It was as though they were familiar with the sound and only needed a warning to be afraid of it, perhaps thanks to a past experience. We didn't chat much more after that, and when we had finally sealed the last jar of honey, I quickly went on my way and hurried back to the farmhouse before nightfall. For close to 20 days after the night in the fields, things were mostly quiet. I had heard the howling one other time in the interim, but it had simply started around nightfall and lasted for about half an hour with no other weird occurrences to speak of. I remember the night of the final incident distinctly because there was a bright, full, or very close to full, moon in the sky, and without it, I may not have been able to see what I witnessed that night. It was a cool and crisp Friday evening, and my girlfriend was staying with me at the farmhouse, as neither of us had work in the morning. We had spent the afternoon helping one of my neighbors put out decorations around her own farm, because she and her husband would be doing hay rides and a haunted trail that weekend. After all, Halloween was only a few days away. It just had to be the extra spooky time of year, didn't it? After that, we had returned to my place as the sun was beginning to set. We then worked all evening on a flurry of baking and home cooking, taking advantage of all the fresh fall produce. Anyway, after an afternoon of lugging hay bales and pumpkins and scarecrows all over my neighbor's property, as well as a hectic evening of cooking, we were both completely tuckered out. We headed to bed around 11 o'clock. The both of us were so exhausted that we fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up in the middle of the night. My watch on the bedside table said 2:20, and I was suddenly very awake. I wasn't sure yet what had awakened me, but I could tell right away that I was not going to be able to get back to sleep for a while. I didn't want to wake up my girlfriend, as she was still sound asleep, so I figured I would just get some water from the kitchen and find something to read until I was tired enough to fall back asleep. As I walked downstairs and into the kitchen, the pleasant scents of cinnamon and sugar and fresh fruits filled my nose and got me thinking of all the fine desserts I would be enjoying in the next few days. But as I held a glass under the faucet to fill it with water, I was snapped out of my daydreaming by the fact that if I listened closely, I could hear the howling. By then, I might as well have had a cup of full-strength coffee, because I was wide awake. The howling had never persisted so late into the night before, and it had never been so loud for me to hear it inside the house so clearly. I walked briskly to the parlor at the front of the house, and I noticed that the howling was even louder there. I have to admit, I was more than a little bit hesitant to open the blinds of the front window, scared of what might be awaiting me on the other side of the glass. My curiosity was stronger than my fear, though, and I quietly unfurled the blinds, letting the sapphire moonlight filter into the otherwise dark room. Thankfully, there was no Mothman or werewolf waiting on the front porch, and as I scanned the yard and tree line, I was almost disappointed that there was no obvious source to the noise. However, as I looked closer, I spotted something I had missed at first glance. Sitting there in the driveway, so still as to be almost invisible, was the shape of a deer. If it weren't for the bright moonlight, I may have overlooked it completely. On closer inspection, several odd things stood out about the shape. It was not sitting like a deer usually does, down on its belly with its legs tucked underneath it. Instead, it was positioned more like a dog, sitting on its hind end with its rear legs tucked at its sides and its front legs supporting it as it leaned forward. Most strikingly, it had a magnificent crown of antlers, 14 points at least, but by contrast, its body was quite slender. It had so little meat around the middle of it that it really looked malnourished or emaciated. I stared at it for a few moments before coming to my senses, and when I thought more about what I was looking at, I realized that the poor thing must have been pretty badly hurt. With hunters in the woods flushing them out, they're far more likely to wander into the road. While deer are pretty tough animals, especially big bucks with 14-point racks, it's not uncommon for a deer to limp or drag itself away from the scene of an accident, only to perish of starvation a few weeks later due to its injuries. I figured that the animal in the driveway had probably been hit on a nearby road a week or so ago and had broken its back legs, hence the gaunt appearance and strange posture. Furthermore, the responsible thing to do with such an animal is to grant it a quick and merciful death in order to keep it from suffering too much or from contracting diseases in its weakened state that it could transmit to other members of the herd or even people. With that in mind, I retrieved my .44 from the safe and loaded the cylinder before going back upstairs to warn my girlfriend. I didn't think she would exactly appreciate being awakened at 2:30 in the morning by the sound of a gunshot less than 50 yards from the house. I shook her awake gently and told her that a deer had been hit by a car and that I had to go out and put it out of its misery. She just groggily pulled a pillow over her head and said, "Tell me about it in the morning," before rolling over and going back to sleep. I made my way down to the front entrance, but as soon as I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the front porch, I realized that something was very strange. The sound of the howling was extremely intense. It was as though I was in the middle of a tornado, and yet there was nothing more than a slight breeze blowing through the chilly evening air. The sound was so intense, it seemed to be pressed on my ears and reverberated in my chest, making me tense up and brace myself against its force. As I slowly inched closer to the deer shape, the howling grew louder and louder, and I began to notice a few more things about the deer in the driveway. I had initially observed the deer's thin body as a sign of malnutrition and starvation, but its ribs weren't sticking out or even really showing. It simply had a small and thin frame. From a closer perspective, I could also see that its fur was immaculate and glossy, without a single matted or bloodied patch anywhere. Certainly not what you'd expect of an animal that had been recently hit by a truck. I couldn't really make out the color of its fur in the brilliant silver moonlight, but I could very much tell that it was not the trademark tawny coat of your average whitetail. It had remained facing away from me the whole time, but as I drew closer to a distance of about 15 yards or so, it turned its head to face me. Its head was the correct shape for a deer or elk, but where its face and eyes and nostrils and mouth should have been, there was nothing at all. Its head was simply covered in a featureless coat of fur matching the rest of its body. The howling was deafening now, and I was left with only one explanation. The creature was the source of the phantom howl that had hung over the farm for the past month, and I was face to face with it, or rather face to not face. I stared in a combination of awe and horror at the bizarre animal sitting before me, and I slowly lowered my hand to my side, finding the grip of my revolver. It's difficult to describe, but I could tell the creature was watching my hand, despite its lack of eyes. I left my hand on my gun, but made no effort to draw it from its holster or pull the hammer back. We simply stared at one another for several moments before the deer thing began to move. Effortlessly and gracefully, without making a single sound other than the constant howl, it stood up on two legs, rising to its full height in the brilliant light of the moon. It stood noticeably taller than me, making it comfortably over 6 feet tall, though that's not counting the considerable bulk of the antlers that rose still higher above its head. It had an ever so slight hunch to its stance, as though it split its time equally between standing upright and being on all fours. Its arms were very long and slender, ending in human-like hands. However, they weren't bony, gaunt, claw-like hands. They were delicate and graceful ones, like those of a young woman. Its legs were articulated like a deer's, and they ended in a pair of split hooves like a deer. But the structure of the legs was far more dense and muscular to support walking upright. As for me, I should have been pumping the thing full of lead or screaming or quaking in abject terror, but instead, I had actually begun to feel calm. there was a towering, faceless deer man standing less than 25 feet in front of me, but I was calm. It was then that I realized the howling had ended. The night air was tranquilly serene, with no noise except for the slight rustle of the October breeze through the trees and bushes. I have no idea how long we stood there looking at each other, but finally the deer thing dropped back to all fours, turned calmly, and bounded off down the hill toward the fields. I followed it with my eyes for several moments, before it seemed to simply vanish into the silver light of the moon and the midnight mist rising from the damp grass. The next thing I remember was waking up the following morning, having slept soundly the entire night. I don't remember going back inside, and I was so at ease and well rested that for a moment I thought the events of the night before were simply a dream, a fabrication of my stressed out mind to give me some sort of fake closure. However, as I got out of bed, I saw that my revolver was lying on the nightstand beside it, and upon closer inspection there were 6 unfired shells in the cylinder. Likewise, as soon as my girlfriend rolled over and saw that I was awake, she asked me what had happened to the wounded deer the night before. I told her that it must have been fine, since it had run off by the time I'd gotten outside, which seemed a lot easier than recounting the full tale of the thing I saw in the early morning hours. After that night, I never heard the howling again, but to this day, coyotes don't often trespass on my land. I am not sure just what the thing I saw was, but I have my hunches. Way back in my family tree, the first of my family to own the land where the farm now sits married a full-blooded Catawba woman, and he received the land as a part of dowry. Technically, this means that I'm part Native American, but the percentage for me is so small that I don't really identify with it at all. However, my grandfather was much closer to that part of the family's heritage, and when he taught me to hunt as a child, he always stressed to me the importance of giving thanks for the bounty of the land and properly respecting it. Have a good harvest of apples that you can't handle yourself? Leave some for the deer. Have more blackberries than you need? Leave those for the birds. Only take what you can take without harming the natural balance of the land. That sort of thing. My theory is that the thing I saw on that autumn night was a spirit, or a creature, or a guardian, something like that, which is tied to the land and keeps it in balance. It attacked those coyotes because they are invasive and destructive, and it may have very well been behind the disappearance of that poacher all those years ago. I'm not sure about why it disappeared after that night either. Maybe its work was just finished here. But I do know one thing for sure, that even though I haven't heard the howling or seen that thing in almost 8 months, I know it's still out there. That being said, I'm not worried. My family has always cared for the land, and if the creature had wanted to harm me that night under the moon, I'm sure it could have. I've never told anyone else about this. I mean, who'd believe me? For now, though, things are calm, and with a little bit of luck, they'll stay that way for a long time to come. The Skinwalker in CANNOCK Chase, from JRG 962. I know this may sound weird, but maybe there is a reasonable explanation. This took place in a wooded area known as CANNOCK Chase. I was taking a hike there. Black-eyed children's stories are pretty common around here, and the place always gave off a creepy vibe, but still, this event took me off guard. I was alone during the afternoon, around 2 p.m. I was exploring, trying to get in some steps. I began to hear noises like twigs snapping, and soon I began to hear disembodied voices, which immediately sent chills up my spine. I began to power walk back to the edge of the chase, but I had 2 miles to go. I tried to put it down to rabbits or likely deer, But one thing wild critters out here could not do was snap their fingers, and that's what I began to hear next. Someone snapping their fingers together in the distance. I turned slowly to face the sound, and soon I saw a man. He seemed to look like a normal guy. His clothes were hiking gear, and he appeared to be smiling, although the rest of him looked very out of place, because his arms were longer than his legs, and his skin was torn almost, like a zombie in The Walking Dead. And then he reached out one of his hands and beckoned me to follow him. I reached behind me to grab my pocket knife. When I turned back to him, though, there was no longer a man there, but a deer. A big deer that rushed towards me and knocked me to the ground before racing away. I laid there frozen in fear before picking myself back up and forcing myself to run home as fast as I could. I thought it was over. I honestly assumed it was one of those terrifying one-off experiences that you share around a campfire. But that night, after I went to bed, I woke up to a strange sound, one that was at first comforting, and then the most horrifying thing I'd ever heard. It was my mother's voice, asking me to let her in just downstairs. I entered the hallway and checked the room near me, and my mother was still in bed. I ran back to my room and covered my head in my blanket, trying to ignore the sound. But the thing mimicking my mother's voice soon grew angry and let out a terrifying shriek that sounded more like a dog dying than my mother. I lay there all night, pretending to be asleep and hoping it was all a nightmare. Creature in the Woods, from Cameron. I live in a nice district called Rhineland in Paducah, Kentucky. It was the usual night me and my best friend at the time, Austin, were about to sneak out of his house. I would always stay the night with him on the nights we would sneak out, just because it was easier at his place, and I wouldn't have to walk 30 minutes to meet up with him. We were both in high school at the time. He was a senior and I was a sophomore. I always hung out with the older crowd my whole life. Anyway, we had snuck out to do the normal mischievous things. We were walking around the neighborhood, which is by the Rhineland food giant. As we were walking, we came to a bend in the road with about a 3-acre field in front of it. Maybe more. It's been a long time since this happened, and I haven't really told anyone about this. I'm 27 now, married with 3 kids. Back to the story. We were coming up on the bend when we heard the loudest and most disturbing scream. Getting way too freaked out, we decided it would probably be best to head back already. Heading back to his room, we felt a bit safer, and we decided later to go back into the woods. You know how teen boys are. They may get creeped out for a moment, but around their friends, their bravery gets a little too high, especially if the two of them pump themselves up. We trekked back toward the woods, albeit going slower this time. We were maybe 10 feet from the creek, just at the start of the wooded trail, when the scream came once more. It was almost at the same spot. We barely got much closer than last time, so it seemed to me like whatever was screaming was doing it on purpose, watching us, waiting for us to get in this exact spot. Maybe I was just paranoid, but I would soon have an answer to this. Instead of running back to the house this time, we both jumped at first, then stopped, holding our ground silently, waiting for the screeching to end. But the screaming kept going for so long, it defied all logic. That would be physically impossible for any animal to do. It screamed for about 5 or 10 minutes straight. Once again, we decided to get the heck out of there. But what really scared the hell out of us was as we started to run back to the house, the scream exited the woods and began to pursue us. We exited the creek and the woods, we ran up a hill on the way to the house. When my friend's motion light came on, which was attached to his house, I could only barely make out a pale figure running at us. Only for a second, because as quick as we could, we were diving back into his house and locking the doors. We were freaked out the entire night and didn't dare exit the house until sunrise. And personally, I didn't leave the house at night for another month. This put a damper on us sneaking out at all for a long time, and maybe it was a valuable lesson. Because there's something in the woods. Well, I hope you've learned your lesson now. And yes, I'm talking to myself too. Stay out of the woods at night, or if you're alone, or if you're unarmed, or if you plan to stay too long. Dang, just look at all these stipulations. If you're gonna go for a quick jog on a wooded trail, you might survive. But I can't guarantee that the rake himself won't run across your path and ask you for tree fitty. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have your own story you want to share with us, submit it at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. If you want to support the show, check out my Patreon and donate maybe, or explore my merchandise shop via the links below. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode, titled 5 Terrifying Encounters with Supernatural Entities. If it sees you, you're already dead. Raging Reaver says, you have much swag. Boy, I got so much swag it don't fit in my swag bag. We still use swag bags, right? Joshua Chalker says, allergies are a supernatural entity. With no exaggeration, the amount of snot that comes out of my nose with allergies is supernatural. How do I not die of thirst when I have to blow my nose like 80 times an hour? The human body amazes me in the most irritating way. Casca Venom says, if it sees you, you're already dead. Bro, I just finished writing a dream I had down about my grandpa hiding with me and my sister from some clown entity. And he said, if it sees you, it will hunt you down until it gets you. And now I've been seeing lots of messages like this lately. Well, that's really creepy, and I hope that nothing comes of it. Because clowns are terrifying and no one likes being hunted down. Maybe you're just noticing things by coincidence. Then again, it may not be coincidence. Stay safe, Casca Venom, and if you need some anti-clown spray, let me know. Luke Skywalker Indoor says, but if they see me, they're already dead. Darkness for life. Nice little turnaround to make it sound hardcore. If I say something like that, it really hides how afraid I am all the time, every day, and I can't sleep. And Mo asks, hey Darkness, you got any more of them chupacabra stories? Do I have a hick accent that I have trouble hiding every day? Heck yeah, I do. But I always wait a little while, if I've already covered the topic recently. I don't want to annoy people with Wendigo, Skinwalkers, and Chupacabra every day of the week, even though it still happens because people send those stories so often. But you like it, right? Alright? Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode, but don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're amazingly talented and oddly attractive people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. And real quick before I forget, be sure to follow me on Twitter and check out my pinned tweet. I'm looking for the scariest made-up story you can send me in a single tweet, because my friend Limbo the Lost wants to animate some stories, but short ones. So, write me up the scariest thing you could make up in one tweet and reply to that tweet of mine. If it's good, hopefully Limbo will animate it, and I'll definitely narrate it sometime. Thank you, and have a sweet, sweet night.